Hey everyone, I am going to be doing a recitation walkthrough of the dark mode project from today. So this is going to be us making custom hooks and interacting with local storage for the first time, which is going to give us a really powerful way to persist data between browser sessions. So when we refresh the page, we don't lose anything, but also find good ways to share functionality between components. Because up until now, we define all of our functions inside of our components and we pass them around with props. But what if we want to write like a reusable set of logic that we might want to put in place in multiple places? And that's really what a custom hook is. Just a way for us to kind of write some reusable logic that, doesn't belong to any one component. So I have my project cloned, Yarn installed, and Yarn started. You're also going to need to do a yarn add node-sas to get the SCSS files working, but it'll tell you that, if you start it without doing that. But I've already done that here. So my end goal, is to have it when I click on this button for it to toggle dark mode on and off on this application. But before we do that, I want to talk about local storage. What is local storage? Well, our browser is able to store data in more than just the memory of our running JavaScript process. Of course, we have things like cookies that help, track data between browser sessions, but cookies involve like talking to servers, and those are set in their own special way. Local storage is an API that we can use to put values into the browser that it will remember the next time we visit this website or when we refresh the page. I'm on Firefox. On Chrome, this is a little bit different, but you open up your developer tools. In Firefox, we go to Storage. In Chrome, you go to Application, and you're going to see a similar panel in Chrome here, where we see local storage and then our current website. And it looks like I have a bunch of local storage already on my localhost 3000 website from a bunch of old projects that I did. I'm going to delete all those. But the idea with local storage is that it's key and value pairs. Everything's key and value pairs. Thought you could get away from them. Nope. Objects, props, local storage, key value pairs. They're everywhere. This is the way we interact with it. We have these functions on window inside of the local storage object, which is an object that has our local storage in it. We can add items to local storage with window.localStorage.setItem. And will it let me zoom in? No, it doesn't let me zoom in here. That's a shame. I apologize if this is a bit hard to read. So we do window.localStorage.setItem, and then we give it a key, right? This is like the key in our object, or our prop name. This is the variable name. This is the key that we're going to reference to get this object back out, or to change its value. So I'm going to call my key test key, and then I have to give it a value. In local storage, our value always has to be a string. So I can set an item with a key of test key and a value of some string. Now if I go back and check local storage, again, I think this is app inside of Chrome, we see this has a key of test key and a value of some string. But if I wanted to, I can actually just edit this in here. Yeah. And now, if I go back to my console, I can access that value. If I look in window.localStorage, we can see that it's an object. But we also have this function, window.localStorage.getItem, which we can give a key to it, and it will give us back the value associated with that, which is my string. If I try to get a key that isn't in there, does not exist, it's going to give me null back. So it's going to be relevant for what we do later. Now, this isn't to say that local storage is useless for trying to store anything that isn't a string, because JavaScript has this built-in JSON.stringify function, which allows us to take our JavaScript data structures, like an array, and turn it into a string. So I'm going to save that into a variable, JSON.stringify, my array of 1, 2, 3. And then I can parse that back out. If I use JSON.parse on array string, I get an array back, even though array string is literally a string. JSON allows us to encode our JavaScript data structures as strings with JSON.stringify, and then parse them back into usable data with JSON.parse. We can use this to store complicated stuff inside of our local storage. So I could do window.localStorage. Lily, I went and I just changed it in the DevTools. If I go into the storage things, I can literally just double click on this and be like, change in the string, and now its value is different. So this is not like a hyper secure method of storing data. Your users have access to it. They can copy it, they can change it. It's just kind of a convenient thing to us. This is not a super secure thing. So I can use window.localStorage.setItem to store things like arrays. So I'm going to give it a key of R, and then my value, I'm going to do JSON.stringify and 1, 2, 3. So now if I check my local storage, we can see I have my array string in there, and if I wanted to, I can parse that back out. JSON.parse, window.localStorage.getItem, my array. Now I get my JavaScript array back. We can do this with arrays, we can do this with numbers, we can do this with objects. JSON.stringify doesn't work on like complicated or custom classes. No date objects with JSON.stringify. No weird classes that aren't built into JavaScript. But it works for our basic data structures, and that's really enough. So, any questions about local storage?
Okay, so what window did you go to, and what were you saying it was for Chrome?
For Chrome, I can actually just open up a Chrome window. Why don't we do that? I believe it's called app. So if I go in here, inspect, go into application, then here on my side I see local storage. If I click this down, it gives me my current website. And these are all the old local storage values that I have defined from old projects.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, and we can see I have, arrays and objects and stuff stored in here. This one's big. This was from the Instagram project. That I don't know where they moved that one, but that was a hard one. Okay. Well, that is local storage. Any other questions with it?
I noticed that you explicitly write window.localStorage, but
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in my console and I just type in local storage, it brings up the same object. Is there a difference or best practice to that?
No, it doesn't really matter. Local storage is defined outside of the window object, and you can use it just like this. Same thing with like set timeout. These are defined directly, but we also have window dot like set interval and set timeout. I don't know if there's if it's better to use one over the other. They're literally the same thing. My guess, my assumption would be that the window dot is a bit safer because that's in a restricted namespace, whereas I could just go out and define a new function called local, storage that does my own thing, and that's going to potentially mask the existing function. So As long as you're not doing anything like that, I don't think it matters too much.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome. You might also, like your text editor might say like local storage off the window object is not defined. That's just because it doesn't know that it's defined. You're not defining it anywhere. But it's still going to work when you run it in the browser. Okay. Any other questions with local storage?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Mhm.
When you try to access an undefined value in local storage, why does it return null instead of undefined?
Undefined is less of a negative value as it is kind of more like the value doesn't exist. So undefined is undefined in its, what's the word I'm looking for? Connotation is a bit more wishy-washy. Like if we define a function that takes an argument and we don't give a value to that argument when we call the function, that argument's value as a variable inside the function is going to be undefined. And that's because it's not that, you know, it we defined it like it just we didn't give it any value. You know, it's kind of the absence of a value. But I don't want to say that because you can literally have absent values in JavaScript. Like I can make an array that has a bunch of nothings in it. But that's kind of what undefined is like. Whereas null is a bit more stricter of a negative. You know, it's like, yeah, I'm telling you on purpose this doesn't exist. You know, undefined is returned by default when you run a function if it doesn't return a value. But if a function returns null, then we know it's a bit more purposeful that it's done this for us. Does that distinction matter a lot? No, not really. We saw earlier today where it matters, where if we set a prop to be undefined in React, React can't tell if we set it purposefully to be undefined versus if it's undefined because we just didn't define it. And so that can cause errors when you're using managed inputs because it doesn't know that you actually tried to set the value to some variable. Whereas if it saw null, then it would be like, oh, like it, you know, they're trying to set this. They don't want anything there yet, but like, you know, they've given us a value. So null is just a bit more concretely negative than undefined. In different languages, there aren't really that many. There's only one like a negative value. Often languages will only have null, and there's not also undefined, but it's one of the quirks of JavaScript. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions with local storage?
Is this where our passwords are usually stored for the website?
Nope, this would be a very bad place to store a password because I can just go and see what this is and change it. So you don't want to store any values inside of local storage that you would be concerned with a user or potentially an attacker that's able to run JavaScript on this web page to, you know, be able to see. This is just, it's like a sticky note, you know. This is essentially like public data. So we use it to store like settings like keep me logged in, you know, so that when they log in, we know that we should send something to the server that, you know, keeps them logged in. It can store user settings like, you know, dark mode. Do they want dark mode on and off? Do they want the font size to be different? You know, what behavior do they want by default in some application? What order should these show up in? You know, these kinds of settings that are harmless is generally where we want to put things in local storage. So, no sensitive data.
That's actually how Adrian Lama was able to change Yahoo News.
Oh, really?
Because of a local storage issue.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. I mean, in your build week, you'll probably be storing some information that best practices you shouldn't store in local storage. And that's because it's easy and it's fast and cookies are a little bit more complicated. So it's fine to get things working with local storage, but you shouldn't ship an application to anyone in production that stores anything in local storage that you don't want to give everyone in the entire world access to. That should kind of be the bar. So I don't care if, you know, anyone can figure out if this user has dark mode enabled or not. Not a big deal to me. All right. Any other questions with local storage? Okay. Let's get started. So we're going to go into source and we're going to create our first custom hook. I'm going to create a directory called hooks, like components. I'm going to make my first hook. I'm going to call this use local storage.js. And at the top of this file, I'm going to import use state from React. Notice I didn't import React because I don't need it here. I'm not writing any JSX, so I don't actually need React. The idea is I'm going to define a function called useLocalStorage that works very similarly to the useState hook. But when I save my values, I also want to put them in local storage so that if we do a refresh, it's going to check and see if I already have a value saved there and be able to use my preference. I'm also going to have to export this. So what does useState look like? Well, useState is a function, and it takes an initial value. And what it does is it returns to me an array with two things, the value and then a function to set the value. This is basically what I want useLocalStorage to be. I want to be able to give it an initial value, and then I want it to give me back the current value and a function to change that value. The one difference is going to be that I also need a key when I put things in local storage. So I'm going to need that piece of information as well. So here, in order to store stuff in local storage, I'm going to need a key. And then, just like useState, I want an initial value. So with useState, we give it an initial value, and we get back this array with the value, and then a function to change that value. A good place to start might be using what useState already has for us. useState already has a nice interface for us to, set a value and then get back a function to change that value. And this is what we mean by custom hook. We're not starting by scratch, we're kind of more customizing a hook than we are creating a custom hook. So I'm going to make use of useState, and I'm going to get this array. I'm going to call this stored value and set stored value because that's what the instructions told me. And then I'm going to give useState the initial value. But that doesn't quite accomplish my task, because what if I have a value defined in local storage already? I want to use that instead of the initial value that I'm getting from my user. I want to use my stored value. Well, useState has a very nice feature where instead of giving it an initial value, I can give useState a callback. And what that callback returns is going to be used as the initial value for useState. So I can give this a callback, and then I can return whatever value I want useState to use as the initial value for stored value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check local storage. So I'm going to do window.localStorage.getItem, and I'm going to grab the key that the user has given us. I'm going to see if this is in local storage, and I'm going to save this into a variable called item. Now I can use an if statement here, or I can use a ternary. I'm going to do it both ways for those of you that are still a little shaky on the ternary operator. So I'm going to do if item is defined, because if this wasn't in local storage, we'd get null. So if the item is defined, then what I want to do is I want to return the item. But when we store this item into local storage, we have to make sure it's a string. So we're going to have to parse it back into whatever data that it was before we stored it. So we're going to run json.parse on it. That's going to give us back our array, our object, our number, our boolean, hint hint, or whatever else that we had wanted to store in there. If the item is not defined, then I can go ahead and use the initial value, because this proves to me that the user has not previously set this in local storage, so I can trust whatever they gave me as the initial value. I want to rewrite this using ternaries. So ternary is an expression. So unlike this if statement, we can use the ternary to represent whatever value it's going to evaluate to. So I can return the result of the ternary. And the format of the ternary is an expression that returns true or false, question mark, which is the ternary operator, the true branch, a colon, and then the false branch. So this is essentially equivalent to what I've done here, but on one line. So I'm going to replace this. My expression, I just want to check and see if item is true or not. For the true branch, I want to parse that item into whatever data that it was. And for the false branch, I'm just going to use the initial value. And those are essentially equivalent. This syntax is a little bit terse and perhaps unfriendly, but it allows us to write code that when we're familiar with it is much easier to read, just left to right. If item is defined, parse it, otherwise use the initial value. One line. Any questions with this so far?
Yeah, how come there's no return on initial value?
It is. Essentially what I've done here is I can wrap this all in a set of parentheses, because this ternary is going to run and it's going to get replaced by whatever value that it gives back. That's why we're able to use ternary operators inside of our curly braces in React. It's an expression. It's going to evaluate to a value, and I'm returning that. I would not do something like this. In fact, I get errors for doing that. All right, this is going to evaluate to either the parsed item or the initial value, and then that is going to get returned. Does that answer your question?
It does perfectly,
Okay,
thank you.
awesome. And Jay asked in the channel, when I say I'm getting initial value from the user, do we mean we're going to snag it from the browser? No. I should be more clear. I mean, whoever is using this function. That user is us. But we're writing this as kind of a general purpose thing that you can literally copy paste into any project that you write from here on out whenever you want to persist some value into local storage. This is just inherently reusable logic. Okay, and then I saw a hand go up. I didn't see whose that was. You can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Do we know what item is right now? Like, do we know if it's an object or like a string or anything?
We know it has to be a string, because that's the only thing we can store in local storage. But we're going to parse it back into whatever JavaScript data type that it actually was. And we're going to see we haven't set this value of item because I don't want to use actually this set stored value. That's not the function I'm going to be returning to whoever uses this function. We're going to be writing our own custom function that stringifies whatever value that we're given before putting that into local storage. So that way we're not like parsing a thing that isn't meant to be parsed. We're always going to be translating whatever value we're given into a JSON stringify string, and that way we can always be sure we can parse it back. But any value we do store in local storage must be a string. It doesn't have to be a parsable string. It might just be like a you know, a normal string that doesn't parse into anything, but we're going to enforce that as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So I've done this. And what I want this to do is I want my use local storage to have the same essential interface as use state. So I want to return an array that has my stored value in it, which is either going to be from local storage or the initial value we were given. But then I also need to give it a setter function. And as I just said, I don't want it to be set stored value, because that's just going to set it in the state. It's not going to do anything about actually persisting this into local storage. So I'm going to need to write that. I'm going to call it set value. And this is going to take a value. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to call set stored value, because use state is already going to do its job in terms of keeping track of this value for us and triggering re-renders and actually figuring out like how to make this work behind the scenes. Like how does this value even get updated in the new component? I don't know. I don't really care, because I can just build on top of what use state has. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to save my value into local storage. Window.localstorage.setItem. I'm going to use the key that I was given. I'm going to set its value to be the JSON.stringified version of that value, because we can only store strings in local storage. And now we're 100% sure that whatever value we've put in here has been stringified. And that means we're allowed to parse it back. Right here. So now I can return this function, setValue. And this interface is almost identical. Let me get this a bit more centered. So now my use local storage, it's going to take a key and an initial value. And then it gives me back an array that has the value and a function to set this one's value, which we're doing here. We're just reusing the interface that useState has offered us. But then I'm also adding my own custom functionality to it, where we also save that value in local storage, so that the next time we refresh the page, when we're getting the initial value, we're going to find it in local storage, and we're going to use that. So now we get to actually save these values between times we use our application. Does anyone have any questions with this?
If so the whole point of the parsing and the stringify is just because keys and strings. Can you send over, like, per se, it wasn't just like, what are they, bars or, you know, integers? Per se, you wanted to do like a whole function. Could you just like stringify anything?
We can test that. We
Okay.
can see what happens, because we know the local storage can only have strings in it, so we can test what values we can stringify using our REPL. I really want to push using the REPL, because this is a wonderful question and answer machine essentially. So I'm just going to make an anonymous function that doesn't do anything. It's going to return null. I'm going to try to stringify it and see what happens. It didn't work. So one of the things we can't stringify are functions, because they don't have any good representation as a string. And that's also not something that we generally want to be passing what we would call over the wire. JSON is a format, you know, that we've seen that is useful for us to encode JavaScript data into a string so that we can send it over the internet. That's largely where JSON sees its use, is for APIs to give us data back. And we probably don't want to be sending functions over that interface.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just curious because, you know, nowadays you can use processing power from the server
Mm-hmm.
and some like apps would have the functions on your end.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that they just don't.
I mean, if you really wanted to, you could put this function inside of a string, and then there is a function in JavaScript called eval that will
There you go.
interpret a
That's what I
string as JavaScript. So there are hacks to do it, but a function doesn't have direct representation in JSON because that's not really the scope of that. So I have some questions in Slack. Catherine is asking, can we just decide to return something as an array in JavaScript? Yeah. I mean, we can return any value we want. I'm just constructing this array in line, but I could do something like const array, you know, is equal to stored value and set value, and then return my array, because I can return whatever variable, whatever data I want. It's just that this is an admittedly somewhat hacky way to return multiple values. Some language offers support out of the box to return multiple values at one time. We don't have that ability, so if I need to return 2 bits of data, I can just put it in an array. And I can let whoever called the function sort out how to get those values out of the array. But luckily we have destructuring, which gives us easy access to that. Kevin asked, where do you access that console REPL? If you go into your DevTools, you know, do inspect element, you should have a console here. And these, you know, 2 little lines indicate that I can run JavaScript. In Chrome, we can do essentially the same thing. I can inspect and then go into console, and here we go. 1 + 1 is 2. There we are. You can also use REPL.it, you know, if you want to spin up JavaScript or any other language in a REPL. But this is just a quick way to access that. All right. Any questions with what I've done here? Okay. So before I use this inside of my use dark mode hook, I want to test it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go up into my index.js. I'm going to import this. So I'm going to import use local storage from hooks, use local storage. Then I'm going to use it the same way I essentially use state. You know, local, set local. I can call these whatever I want. Use local storage. I want this to be stored in a key called test key, and I'm going to give it an initial value, and I can give this any data structure I want. Let's do an array with 1, 2, 3, because that's going to get stringified. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to render that inside my application. I'm just going to do, I'm actually going to JSON.stringify it here so that we can actually see it in our page. But I'm going to stringify that value of local, and then I'm going to save this. And we see very small at the top our array of 1, 2, 3. But what happens if I change this initial value? I'm going to change it to a string called something else. It should, if it's working correctly, when I run this, 1, 2, 3 is still going to show up, because use local storage is going to see that I have a value saved in my local storage, and it's going to use that one instead. Let's see. We can check our local storage. Oh no. Oh, this isn't cookies. I was like, oh, did I do it wrong? So we go to local storage, and we see oh wait. That's not right. What did I do? Let's go into use local storage. I am indeed using this key. I'm going to change this to be something else. So my key is called something. and now I see something else. And it might be... Uh-oh, why is that not showing up in local storage? Oop, I made a goof. Oh, I know where I made a goof. Does anyone see it? Where am I actually storing this inside of local storage? Inside of my set value function. Am I ever calling that? Nope. So if I want to actually intern this value in my local storage, I have to make sure to call this setLocal function. Or I can actually define this up here, and then when my initial value is not defined, I can store that here. But I actually like how this is set up, because unless, the user kind of intervenes and sets it, it's still going to have its default value on each re-render. So I don't really need to worry about that. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to call setLocal and give it a value here. Let's just give it some string. And now we see our key of something with some stuff on there. And I get an error. That's because I'm calling this every time we re-render the page. I'm going to put this inside of the use effect. And now we get this. But if I remove this from my page, we're still going to see it right there, even if I change this initial value. That's because the user has it in local storage, so when our app refreshes, it's going to go and get it. But if I delete it from here, and then refresh my page, now it's going to say not numbers, because I don't have that value in my local storage anymore. Does anyone have any questions with that? I don't see any typing. Okay. So we're going to implement our use dark mode hook real fast. So I'm going to rip this out of app because I don't need it. And then we're going to write use dark mode. So I'm going to make a new file called use darkmode.js. I'm going to import use state, or I'm sorry, I'm going to import use effect because I'm actually going to use that later from React. And I'm also going to import my use local storage hook because I want the user, when they decide to use dark mode or not, for that to happen the next time they visit the site. That's a perfect use case for local storage. So that's going to be a relative path from where I currently am, and that's going to be in the use local storage file. So then I'm going to define a function called use dark mode, and I'm going to export that. Now, what interface do I want dark mode to have? Well, very similar to use effect again. I'm going to copy, to use state again. I want it to take an initial value. It's either true or false. By default, I'll make it false. I don't want users to automatically have dark mode because I hate their retinas. And then I want it to return an array that has the value of dark mode, either true or false, and then a function that will set the value of that dark mode to change it. Flip it on and off. We could even make this function just be like, toggle dark mode, but I'll leave it as kind of a setter value. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our local storage hook because that gives us a way to set an initial value or use the one that's already in local storage, which is the exact behavior that I want. So use dark mode is going to take an initial value, and I'm going to use my local storage hook, and I'm going to give it the key for this. Let's make it dark mode. And let's give it our initial value. And then I'm going to save this in a variable. We'll call it dark mode and set dark mode. And then I can return those. But I'm missing an important step, which is actually turning the browser into dark mode. And the way we're going to do that is via DOM manipulation. We could, do some stuff inside of our application to change classes. Because what we need to do to engage dark mode based on the README is just add a class called dark-mode to the body tag. But I want to do that in here, so I'm actually going to need to manipulate the DOM, because I don't have any other access to our components. We don't have to use a query selector, because the body tag is directly defined off document. So I can mess with this thing's class list just like I could back in vanilla JavaScript. But I want to control this behavior based on if dark mode is set or not. So if dark mode is set, then I want to make sure that this class list has a class called dark mode. And if it's not set, then I want it to have a class, or not have a class called dark mode. Notice I'm not using toggle here, because if dark mode was false or null or whatever, and then we ran toggle and it didn't have the dark mode tag on it, then we'd actually add it. So I want these add and removes here manually. There's a problem with what I've written though. Does anyone know what it is? Where are we going to run use dark mode?
Navbar?
Yeah, we're going to do it inside of navbar. We're going to do it right inside of that component. And so how often is this function going to run? Well, whenever we re-render navbar, right? Whenever that component gets rendered, it's going to run all the code inside of it. And so it's going to run use dark mode. And then we're going to be constantly doing these DOM manipulations on every re-render. And that's wasteful. Luckily, we have another hook called useEffect that lets us run code sometimes. I don't want to run this code always. I want to run it sometimes. Another way to think of it is this code is a side effect. It's going out and it's changing the world. And when we do things like that, we probably want to limit their usage. I don't want to do this on every re-render. I don't want to go out and change the world whenever my React app decides to re-render. I only want to do it if it's called for. And that's exactly what useEffect allows me to do. Because I can call useEffect, and I can give it a callback function. And that's going to run my side effect code. The code that, performs the DOM manipulation. And then I can give it a dependency array. So when do I want this code to run? On what data does this code depend on for its functioning? Those are the same question. The answer is going to be dark mode. Because if dark mode is true, if it's set on, we're going to run this code, and then I don't care to run it until the value of dark mode changes again. It provides no value to me to run this code until dark mode is now set to false. Vice versa, the exact same way. So this way we're limiting when we run this code to only when the value of dark mode changes. useEffect is the best. I love it. Does anyone have any questions about this? This is kind of funky. I don't see any typing. We feeling good with this?
That return is inside of the use effect, right? It's a little bit hard to tell from your.
No, it is not. It is not. I don't care what the return value of the use effect is. That's kind of the whole point. Because I'm performing a side effect. This is modifying the world. I don't really care what value it returns. This is what my use dark mode hook, what the use dark mode function returns. Because I want it to have the same style as use state. It returns this array of value and set value. So I'm returning dark mode and set dark mode.
Okay, got it.
So now I can actually use this inside my application. We're going to do this inside of our navbar component, which is going to have our toggle in it, which I've broken by zooming in a bunch. It's actually kind of funny that it expands beyond there. I'm also going to fix a bug. So I'm going to import that hook. So I'm going to import use dark mode from up a level, down into hooks, and use dark mode. And right now I'm using this use state.
Hey,
or
Henry?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
was the navbar JS file already in our project?
Yes.
Huh.
It should be inside the components directory. If we're looking in source, where index.js, we should have components and then navbar. It's a .jsx file, which we sometimes use to distinguish from a normal JavaScript file, but should be right in there.
Okay, cool. I see. I was thrown off by the JSX.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that just, we sometimes want like different code highlighting and different linters and stuff on these React files that contain JSX. So we use that extension to make our code editor's life a little bit easier. Like right now, the mode I just have every JavaScript file open in React mode, just because that's most of the JS code that I write. But that's not always what we want. So what we're using inside of navbar already is use state, and we're using that to keep track of whether dark mode is toggled or not. But use dark mode, we've just proven conclusively in these comments, has the exact same interface as use state, but it has the added bonus of actually doing the legwork for setting dark mode. So I should, as the README says, be able to drop this in and see the magic happen. So right now it's initially set to false, but if I click this, we should be toggling using the toggle mode function, which is going to invert the value of dark mode. Let's see if it works. Oh, that's real nice. Look at that. Amazing. Now I want to fix a bug real fast, which is this toggle. This might not necessarily be a bug, but the toggle doesn't work if you don't click exactly on the button. I'm just going to move this on-click handler up into the main div. That way I don't have to be so accurate with my clicks. This way I can just click anywhere I want in there. Alright. And we can see this is being set inside of our local storage. We can see this value being updated. But if I delete... Now let's refresh the page. We're in dark mode. If I delete this and then refresh the page, we lose it. But I can set it back. Does anyone have any questions with this?
Is dark mode from the start a string then?
Nope. It is a Boolean value. True or false?
I mean, like inside of use state when we get the initial value, we have like value set value that we get like from the actual window. Is that a Boolean then when we use the parsin thing?
Yeah, inside of use local storage, when we store the value inside of local storage, I'm stringifying it here. So true and false get translated into strings that say true and false. But when I parse them back out, they get turned back into the literal Boolean values, true and false.
Okay, that's what I was
Okay.
wondering, if item itself was like true or false.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
cool.
see in this window, this is just a string. You know.
Initially I thought it was like an object. I don't know. I think I read the
Oh.
readme wrong.
Okay, yeah. And we can put objects in here with JSON.stringify, and it might be confusing because JSON we normally think of as an object, because JSON literally stands for JavaScript Object Notation. But JSON.stringify allows us to turn any JavaScript data, that it can, into a string and then back again. All right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I don't want to run into after hours time too much. So, do we have any final questions here? All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I will post the code for this right now. Finish.
Hey Henry, real quick, where did you fix that bug with the on click?
So the issue was, let me reset it. The onClick is originally on this div, which is the little orange circle. So if I click outside of the little orange circle, it doesn't actually work. Let me save this. So if I like click right here, it doesn't work because the onClick handler is on the little orange circle. But if I move that up to the div that is actually the entire toggle, now if I click anywhere on the toggle, including the little circle, because the event bubbles up, it'll toggle. And I just like not having to be as accurate in my clicks. Because for a second, when I did this during the day, I was like clicking outside the little circle in the toggle, and I was like, oh god, I broke everything. Yeah, alright. So the code should be here. Ooh, GitHub. What's up? Alright. Yep, and I'll get that posted. And let me stop the recording.